When Viking raiding parties descended upon coastal settlements in England, Ireland, Francia, or Slavic territories, it was not only warriors who faced the sword. What became of their wives? What fate awaited the families of the vanquished? In the brutal framework of Viking society, the defeat of a warrior was not the end of violence. It was its transference. His death stripped his household of its protector, making his wife, daughters and kin suddenly vulnerable to the traditions of a society that prized dominance, vengeance and wealth above mercy. In the sagas and annals of the time, such as the Annals of Ulster or the Chronicon Roskildense, we find sparse yet chilling mentions of what followed Viking victories. Among the Norse, honor and retribution were tightly bound. A man slain in battle did not die alone. His status, land and possessions were forfeit, including his dependents. Widows of defeated warriors were often taken as spoils, konur herteknar, or women taken in war. Some were transported across the seas to Norse settlements like Hedeby or Dublin. There, their fates diverged. To the Vikings, this was not cruelty. It was justice through strength, order maintained by power. The defeated had no legacy to leave, only survivors to subjugate. And in the cold logic of that age, the family of a fallen warrior was simply part of the price of war. Brides by force, strategic Viking marriages. What happens when conquest becomes kinship? In Viking society, some women from defeated tribes were not merely enslaved, they were married. But this was no act of reconciliation. It was strategy. It was subjugation in ceremonial form. Following raids or local conquests, high-status Viking warriors, jarla or even kings, would sometimes forcibly marry the daughters or widows of their enemies. This was not love, nor even mere lust. It was a cold calculation. By taking a noblewoman from a rival tribe or kingdom as a wife, a Viking leader could lay claim to her land, her people, and her bloodline. In the Laxdæla saga, we find the tale of Ketil Flatnose, who led his family from Norway to settle in the British Isles. There, intermarriage, often through coercion, was a common method of consolidating power. While the sagas, written centuries later, sometimes veil such unions in romantic language, the underlying dynamics were brutal. The woman had no choice. Her consent was irrelevant. She was property in a political game. This practice was especially widespread in areas where the Norse sought permanent settlement, like parts of Ireland, northern England and Normandy. After defeating local rulers, Viking chieftains would install themselves as lords over the land, using strategic marriages to legitimize their authority. A widow of a fallen chieftain was seen not as a grieving partner, but as a gateway to his former domain. These marriages served another function: assimilation. By binding themselves to the local population, Viking rulers could stabilize their control, reduce resistance, and ensure loyalty among the subdued. Children born of these unions inherited mixed identities, Norse in blood, local in land and memory. But for the women themselves, these were not unions of reconciliation. They were symbolic acts of domination, living reminders that resistance had failed and that the conqueror now ruled not only the land, but the very bloodline of the defeated. In Viking eyes, these women were not just spoils of war, they were instruments of empire. Viking thrall-taking, the ruthless fate of captured wives. To be captured by Vikings was to enter a world where one's life no longer belonged to oneself. For countless women from conquered tribes, the fate was neither marriage nor death. It was slavery. Known in Old Norse as threll, pronounced thrael, a thrall was the lowest possible status in Viking society, a human being stripped of name, kin, and rights. Viking raids were not merely about territorial expansion, they were economic enterprises. Women and children captured in raids on Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Slavic, and even Scandinavian rivals were often taken alive specifically for the slave trade. The annals of Ulster and Irish Nennius document multiple raids in which a great number of women and youths were seized and carried off to Norse ships, destined for lives of servitude. These captives were brought to thriving markets in trading centres like Hedeby in Denmark, Kaupang in Norway, and Dublin in Ireland. Dublin, in particular, became a notorious Viking slave hub by the 10th century, where Christian captives were sold to Muslim merchants from Al-Andalus and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Vikings, pragmatic and ruthless, recognized that enslaved women, especially young, able-bodied ones, were among the most valuable forms of portable wealth. Once enslaved, a thrall woman's life was grueling. On farms, she labored endlessly, tending livestock, grinding grain, hauling water. In households of wealthier Norsemen, she might serve as a maid, nurse, or wet nurse, but always without autonomy. Her body, too, was at the mercy of her master. Children born under these circumstances were frequently denied status or protection, and unless formally acknowledged by their fathers, they too were subjected to servitude. In Grettir's saga, a thrall woman is described as chattel without word or will, and yet many lived long enough to bear generations of descendants. Over time, some slaves were granted partial freedom or allowed to buy their liberty, but this was rare, and often only after years or decades of labor. Importantly, slavery in Viking society was not based on race, but on conquest and power. A noblewoman from Northumbria, if captured in war, could find herself working beside a Slavic villager or an Irish nun, both stripped of identity, both reduced to tools in a world ruled by the sword. For the defeated, the battle ended in silence. But for their wives and daughters, a second war began. Shamed before the tribe, public humiliation rituals. There are whispers in the historical record, fragments and sagas, that suggest not all conquered women were taken for marriage or slavery. Some may have faced an even more harrowing ordeal, public humiliation, carried out not in secrecy, but before the tribe. While direct evidence for formalized rituals is scarce, hints within Norse literature and early medieval chronicles raise the possibility that such acts occurred, not as isolated cruelties, but as symbolic displays of dominance. In Viking culture, honor was everything. To disgrace an enemy's wife or daughter in public was to erase his legacy, to tarnish his bloodline, and to signal the totality of his defeat. While no formal Viking law codifies public humiliation for captive women, some scholars believe that rituals of shaming could have included stripping captives of their garments, cutting their hair, or forcing them to serve in mock ceremonies that parodied their former noble status. Such gestures, if they occurred, would have been meant not only to degrade the individual, but to send a message to the community. This person, and all she represents, has been defeated. The historical silence may conceal the harshest truths. For the women who endured such fates, their stories remain only in shadows, possible, probable, but forever uncertain. The Viking conquest of defeated warriors' families was not merely an aftermath of war, it was war continued by other means. Through forced marriage, enslavement, and possibly even ritual humiliation, power was asserted not just over the body, but over memory, lineage, and identity itself. These were acts not only of domination, but of erasure. What do you think was the most lasting cultural consequence of Viking integration through conquest? Marriage, slavery, or terror? Comment below and share your reflections. History does not forget. It waits in the silence between what is recorded and what is endured.